judge stops everything when a 9-year-old says this about her billionaire father. "If I was really his treasure, why did he throw me away?" 9-year-old Isabella Martinez's words stopped a packed courtroom cold. The billionaire father who had abandoned her sat just feet away, refusing to even look at the daughter he once claimed to love more than life itself. But Isabella's innocent question would trigger an FBI investigation that uncovered the most shocking truth imaginable. Her father wasn't just abandoning her, he was systematically planning her murder. What began as a simple custody case became a federal RICO investigation involving stolen technology, government fraud, and a criminal network designed to eliminate a little girl whose only crime was existing. This is the true story of how one child's courage and a German shepherd's supernatural instincts brought down a criminal empire that threatened national security. The Saturday morning sun filtered through the dusty windows of Richard Martinez's cramped garage workshop, casting golden rays across a maze of computer parts, tangled wires, and coffee-stained notebooks. 9-year-old Isabella sat cross-legged on a worn cushion beside her father's rickety workbench, her dark eyes sparkling with curiosity as she watched him solder delicate circuits with the precision of a surgeon. "Phillips head screwdriver, please, my little engineer," Richard said without looking up, his voice warm with affection. Isabella's small hand immediately darted to the toolbox, selecting the exact tool with practiced ease. This was their sacred ritual, every Saturday morning for the past 2 years, just the two of them in their makeshift laboratory of dreams. "Daddy, why do the green wires always go to the same place?" Isabella asked, her voice filled with the innocent wonder that made Richard's heart swell. She leaned closer, her pigtails nearly brushing the circuit board as she studied his work with the intensity of a graduate student. Richard paused, setting down his soldering iron to look at his daughter, really look at her. The way she absorbed every word he said, how she remembered the names of components he'd taught her weeks ago, the careful way she handled even the smallest screws as if they were precious gems. "Because, sweetheart, computers are like people. They need their own language to talk to each other. These green wires, they're like whispers carrying secrets." Isabella giggled, a sound that filled the cluttered garage with pure joy. "What kind of secrets?" "The kind that will change everything for our family," Richard said, his eyes drifting to the computer screen displaying lines of revolutionary code. "This AI algorithm I'm working on, it's going to think faster than any human brain ever could. One day, everyone in the world will want this technology." On the workbench beside them sat Isabella's handmade world's best daddy coffee mug, crafted from clay in her 3rd-grade art class. The handle was slightly lopsided, and her 9-year-old handwriting spelled "Daddy" in uneven letters, decorated with tiny hearts. It was Richard's most treasured possession, more valuable to him than all the expensive equipment surrounding them. Taped to his computer monitor was Isabella's latest drawing. 3 stick figures holding hands under a rainbow, labeled "My Family," in purple crayon. "Sandwiches are ready," Maria's voice drifted from the house, accompanied by the screen door's familiar creak. Through the garage's open door, they could see their beat-up Honda Civic parked in the driveway, its faded blue paint and small dent on the rear bumper telling the story of a family making do with what they had. "Oh, can we eat in here today, Daddy, please?" Isabella bounced on her cushion with excitement. "I want to hear more about the computer whispers." Richard chuckled, ruffling her hair. "Of course, Princess. We're a team, aren't we?" "The best team," Isabella declared, then gasped with sudden excitement. "Oh, Daddy, I almost forgot. My birthday party is in 3 weeks, and Jenny's mom said they might get a bounce house. Can you believe it? A whole house that bounces." Her words tumbled out in the breathless rush that only 9-year-olds could manage. As Maria appeared in the doorway, carrying a plate of peanut butter and jelly sandwiches, Richard felt something he couldn't quite name, a perfect moment of contentment that seemed almost too good to be true. His beautiful wife, his brilliant daughter, their modest but happy life built on love rather than luxury. If only he could have frozen that moment forever, before the phone call that would shatter their world into a million irreparable pieces. The phone's shrill ring cut through the garage like a knife, startling Isabella so much that she nearly knocked over Daddy's precious coffee mug. Richard glanced at the unknown number on his cell phone display, his brow furrowing with mild irritation. Saturday mornings were sacred. No business calls, no interruptions. Just father-daughter time in their technological sanctuary. "I should probably take this," he murmured, though his tone suggested he'd rather throw the phone into the nearest trash can. Isabella continued coloring in her notebook, drawing elaborate pictures of robots and computers while humming a tuneless song under her breath. "Richard Martinez speaking," he answered, his voice carrying the weary resignation of a man who'd fielded too many calls from investors who promised the world and delivered nothing. But something changed immediately. Isabella noticed it first. The way Daddy's shoulders suddenly went rigid, like a soldier snapping to attention. Universe. Daddy's eyes had gone wide, wider than she'd ever seen them, and his face was turning an odd shade of pale. The hand holding the phone pressed so tightly against his ear that his knuckles turned white. "Billion? Did you say billion with a B?" Richard's voice cracked like a teenager's. He stood up so abruptly that his chair rolled backward, crashing into a stack of computer manuals. Isabella jumped at the sound, but her father didn't even notice. He was pacing now, 3 steps one way, 3 steps back, like a caged animal who'd just caught the scent of freedom. Yes, I understand the timeline. Monday morning. Of course, I'll be there. Absolutely, I'll sign whatever needs to be signed. Isabella watched in fascination as her daddy transformed before her eyes. His posture straightened, his voice grew stronger and more confident with each word, and something new entered his expression, something hungry and bright and completely focused on the voice coming through that phone. It was like watching a caterpillar suddenly sprout wings, except something about this transformation made Isabella's stomach feel funny. "This is it," Richard whispered after ending the call, staring at his phone as if it were made of pure gold. "This is finally it." "What's it, Daddy?" Isabella asked, her small voice barely audible over the sudden thundering of her heart. Richard looked at her then, but it was different somehow. His eyes seemed to look through her rather than at her, as if he were seeing something far more interesting in the distance. "The government wants to buy my AI technology, sweetheart. They're offering more money than we ever dreamed of." "That's good, right?" Isabella's question hung in the air like a soap bubble, fragile and waiting to burst. Before Richard could answer, his phone rang again, then again, and again. Each call brought new excitement, new possibilities, new reasons for Daddy to pace and whisper urgently into the phone. Isabella's peanut butter sandwich sat forgotten on the workbench as she watched her father slip further and further away from her with each conversation. "We'll need to upgrade our whole situation," Richard said during a brief pause between calls, though Isabella wasn't sure if he was talking to her or to himself. The way he said upgrade made it sound like their current life was somehow broken, something that needed fixing, but Isabella loved their life exactly as it was. Their cozy garage workshops, their simple family dinners, their weekend adventures to the park where Daddy pushed her on the swings, until she felt like she could touch the clouds. "What do you mean, Daddy?" she whispered. Boards and computer whispers. By evening, the garage felt different, emptier somehow, even though nothing had physically changed. That night, as Maria tucked Isabella into bed, the little girl asked the question that would haunt her dreams. "Mommy, when people get lots of money, do they still love the same people?" Maria kissed her forehead, her own heart heavy with a premonition she couldn't name. "Of course, sweetheart. Love doesn't change because of money." But in the garage below, Richard was already researching penthouse apartments and luxury cars, his daughter's drawings forgotten in the shadows of his glowing computer screen. The kitchen table had never felt smaller than it did that Tuesday evening, 3 days after the phone call that changed everything. Maria had made Isabella's favorite meal, spaghetti with butter and Parmesan cheese, simple comfort food that usually filled their modest home with warmth and laughter. But tonight, the only sounds were the soft scraping of forks against plates and the incessant buzzing of Richard's phone. And then Tommy Wilson fell right off the monkey bars, and his pants got stuck on the way down. Isabella giggled, her fork twirling spaghetti with the dramatic flair of a 9-year-old storyteller. Mrs. Henderson had to call the janitor to get him unstuck, and his underwear had little dinosaurs on them. Maria laughed, the sound genuine despite the growing knot in her stomach. Oh my goodness, was Tommy embarrassed? Super embarrassed. His face got as red as a fire truck. And Jenny Martinez, that's a different Martinez, not like us, said it was the funniest thing she'd ever seen, and Isabella paused, realizing her father hadn't even looked up from his phone. "Daddy, did you hear about Tommy's dinosaur underwear?" Richard's eyes remained glued to his screen, his thumb scrolling through what looked like real estate listings. Luxury penthouses with floor-to-ceiling windows and marble countertops filled the small device, each image more extravagant than the last. That's nice, honey," he murmured absently, though his tone suggested he hadn't heard a single word. Maria reached across the table and gently touched Richard's hand. "The phone can wait, can't it? Isabella was telling us about her day." Richard looked up then, but his expression held a flicker of irritation, as if he'd been interrupted during something far more important than family dinner. "Sorry, there's a lot happening right now. Big changes are coming." He set the phone down, but kept glancing at it like an addict separated from his fix. "What kind of changes?" Isabella asked, her voice small and uncertain. Over the past 3 days, she'd watched her father transform into someone she barely recognized. Gone were their Saturday morning workshops, replaced by endless phone calls and mysterious meetings. Gone was the man who used to explain computer circuits with infinite patience, replaced by someone who seemed constantly distracted, always looking toward some invisible horizon she couldn't see. "Good changes, Princess. Amazing changes." Richard's smile didn't reach his eyes. "We're going to have everything we ever wanted. A big house, nice cars, the best schools for you." "But I like my school," Isabella protested, her fork clattering against her plate. "I like Mrs. Peterson, and all my friends are there, and we're doing a play about butterflies next month, and I'm going to be a monarch butterfly with golden wings." "You can be a butterfly anywhere," Richard said dismissively, his attention already drifting back to his phone as another message notification chimed. "In fact, you could probably be in much better plays at private schools where they really invest in the arts." Isabella's eyes filled with tears she didn't understand. Everything Daddy said sounded good. Bigger house, better school, nice things. So why did it feel like he was taking away everything she loved? Richard? Maria's voice carried a warning edge. Maybe we should discuss these changes as a family before making any decisions. Of course, Richard replied, but his words felt automatic, rehearsed. We'll talk about everything once I get through this initial transition period. The rest of dinner passed in uncomfortable silence, broken only by Isabella's occasional attempts at conversation that fell flat against her father's distraction. When they finished eating, Maria began clearing the dishes, while Isabella helped, stacking plates with the careful concentration she'd learned from countless family dinners. Movie night? Maria suggested with forced cheer. Isabella picked out The Princess Bride last week, and we never got to watch it. For a moment, Richard's face softened. The Princess Bride. That's a good choice, Princess. Lots of adventure and true love. They settled onto their worn couch, Isabella nestled between her parents, like she had hundreds of times before. The familiar opening credits filled their small living room with magic, and for 30 precious minutes, Isabella felt like her family was back to normal. Her father's arm wrapped around her shoulders, her mother's hand stroking her hair, the three of them together in their own little world. But as Wesley declared his love for Buttercup, Isabella felt her eyelids growing heavy. The week's confusion and worry had exhausted her 9-year-old mind and body. She curled deeper into her father's side, breathing in his familiar scent of coffee and electronics, feeling safe and loved in the circle of his arms. I love you, Daddy, she whispered sleepily, her small hand shining moment. His heart clenched with the pure, overwhelming love he'd felt since the day she was born. This was his daughter, his little engineer, his princess who drew him crooked pictures and made him lopsided coffee mugs and thought he hung the moon. He carried her to bed with infinite gentleness, tucking her favorite stuffed elephant under her arm, and thought he hung the moon. He carried her to bed with infinite gentleness, tucking her favorite stuffed elephant, and made him lopsided coffee mugs, and thought he hung the moon. He carried her to bed with infinite gentleness, tucking her Steph tenderness would be gone forever, replaced by someone who saw his daughter as nothing more than a relic of a life he was eager to leave behind. The sound that woke Isabella wasn't loud, just the soft whisper of suitcase wheels rolling across hardwood floors and muffled cadence of angry voices trying not to wake a sleeping child. But 9-year-old ears have a way of detecting when their world is about to crumble. Isabella's eyes snapped open in the darkness with the sharp clarity of a child sensing danger. For a moment she lay perfectly still in her narrow bed, clutching her stuffed elephant Peanuts against her chest as she tried to make sense of the sounds drifting through her bedroom door. The luminous hands of her frozen alarm clock showed 3:17 a.m. While with desperation and disbelief, Isabella's heart began to pound so hard she was sure it would wake the neighbors. Daddy was... They're part of my old life now, Maria, Richard said, his voice carrying a cold, calculated tone that made Isabella's blood turn to ice water. I can't be tied down to this. The way he said this, like their family was something distasteful he needed to scrape off his shoe, sent a knife through Isabella's 9-year-old heart that would leave scars for decades. This, Maria's voice cracked with raw emotion. You mean your wife and daughter? The people who loved you when you had nothing but dreams and a garage full of broken computers? Isabella pressed her face closer to the door crack, tears already streaming down her cheeks as she watched her father's face remain perfectly impassive. This wasn't the man who had carried her to bed just hours ago, who had whispered, "Sweet dreams, princess," with such tenderness. This was a stranger, wearing her daddy's face, speaking with her daddy's voice, but with all the love drained out of him like water from a broken glass. "You don't understand the opportunities ahead of me," Richard continued, adjusting his expensive watch, a Rolex that definitely hadn't been there yesterday. "I need to be free to make strategic decisions. I can't have personal complications holding me back from my potential." Personal complications. That's what she was now. Isabella bit her lip so hard she tasted blood, trying not to make a sound that would reveal she was listening to her own father reduce her to a business obstacle. "She's your daughter, Richard. She worships you. How can you stand there and call her a complication?" Maria's sobs were getting louder now, past caring about waking their daughter because she was watching her husband transform into someone she'd never met. "I'll send money," Richard said dismissively, hefting his final suitcase toward the front door. "She'll be fine. Kids are resilient." "Money? You think money replaces a father's love?" But Richard was already at the door, his hand on the handle. He paused only long enough to pull a business card from his wallet and toss it onto their small kitchen table like he was discarding a losing lottery ticket. "My lawyer will be in touch about the details." Isabella watched through her crack in the door as her mother sank onto the couch, her whole body shaking with sobs that seemed to come from the very center of her being. The business card lay on the kitchen table like a death certificate for their family, official and final and impossible to take back. Moving like a sleepwalker, Isabella crept to her bedroom window and pressed her face against the cool glass. Below, she could see her father loading his expensive luggage into a sleek black car she'd never seen before. Not their familiar beat-up Honda, but something that belonged to the wealthy stranger he'd apparently become overnight. For one heart-stopping moment she thought he might look up. She pressed her small hand against the window, hoping against hope that he would see her there, that the sight of his little girl's face would snap him back to his senses, would remind him of Saturday mornings in the garage, and bedtime stories, and the way she always saved him the last bite of her ice cream cone. But Richard never looked up, never paused, never showed even a flicker of doubt or regret as he slid into the driver's seat of his new life and drove away into the darkness, leaving behind nothing but the echo of expensive wheels on asphalt and the sound of his wife's heartbroken sobs. Isabella stayed at the window long after the car's taillights disappeared, her breath fogging the glass as silent tears carved tracks down her cheeks. She was old enough to understand that something irreversible had just happened, but too young to comprehend the full scope of her father's betrayal. All she knew was that the man who had promised to love her forever, who had called her his princess and his little engineer, had just thrown her away like yesterday's newspaper. In the living room, Maria continued to cry, deep, wrenching sobs that seemed to echo through their suddenly empty home, and Isabella realized with the devastating clarity that only children possess that her daddy wasn't coming back. Not tomorrow, not next week, not ever. The golden days were over, and the real nightmare was just beginning. 7 days after the world ended, Isabella sat at their kitchen table, methodically eating cereal that had long since turned to mush, her spoon moving in automatic circles, while her mother stared at her laptop screen with the horrified fascination of someone watching a car accident in slow motion. "Mommy, why aren't you eating?" Isabella asked, though her own appetite had vanished the moment Daddy drove away. Food seemed pointless now, like everything else in their suddenly hollow house. Maria didn't answer immediately. Her fingers trembled as she scrolled through what appeared to be a social media page, her face cycling through expressions of disbelief, hurt, and growing anger. "Isabella, honey," she finally whispered, her voice barely audible, "come here for a minute." Isabella abandoned her soggy cereal and climbed onto her mother's lap, automatically curling into the warm comfort that had become her anchor in this new, frightening world. But when she looked at the laptop screen, her breath caught in her throat. There was Daddy, but not the Daddy she remembered. This version of her father looked like he'd stepped out of a magazine. His hair was perfectly styled, his skin seemed to glow with expensive treatments, and he wore a charcoal gray suit that probably cost more than their rent. Behind him stretched an enormous penthouse with floor-to-ceiling windows offering a panoramic view of the city skyline. Is that really Daddy?" Isabella whispered, her small finger tracing the caption under the photo read, "New chapter, new possibilities. Sometimes you have to leave the past behind to embrace your destiny. #blessed. #new beginnings. #living my best life." Isabella's 9-year-old mind struggled to process the implications. "But Mommy, we're not the past. We're his family." Before Maria could answer, she clicked to the next post, and Isabella's world tilted even further off its axis. There was Daddy again, but this time he wasn't alone. A young woman with long blonde hair and a perfect smile stood beside him, her arm wrapped possessively around his waist. She looked like she belonged in music videos or movie premieres, all gleaming white teeth and designer clothes, and the kind of effortless beauty that made Isabella suddenly conscious of her own tangled hair and cartoon pajamas. The woman was wearing Daddy's watch. The same Rolex he'd been sporting the night he left, now wrapped around this stranger's impossibly slender wrist like a trophy. "Why is that lady wearing Daddy's watch?" Isabella asked, her voice small and confused. "And is that his new house?" Maria's arms tightened around her daughter, as if she could physically shield her from the truth unfolding on the screen. How do you explain to a 9-year-old that her father has not only abandoned his family, but replaced them with a shinier, newer model? How do you find words for betrayal so complete it defies comprehension? Daddy is making some very grown-up mistakes right now," Maria said carefully, each word feeling like she was walking through a minefield. Sometimes adults do things that don't make sense, even to other adults. But Isabella was already scrolling to the next post, her child's curiosity overriding her mother's protective instincts. The new image showed Richard and the blonde woman, Amber, according to the tagged name, at what appeared to be an exclusive restaurant. Champagne flutes raised in a toast. Richard's smile was broader and more genuine than Isabella had seen in months, maybe even years. The caption made Isabella's stomach clench. "To new love and endless possibilities. Some people enter your life and make you realize what you've been missing. #grateful heart, #true love, #worth the wait." "But what about us?" Isabella whispered, tears beginning to spill down her cheeks. "Doesn't he miss us even a little bit?" Maria clicked to the stories section, and Isabella watched in real time as her father documented his new life with the enthusiasm of a teenager. Shopping sprees at stores Isabella had only seen in magazines. Private jet flights to destinations she couldn't even pronounce. Amber trying on diamond earrings that probably cost more than Isabella's college fund. The most devastating post appeared at the bottom of the feed, time-stamped just 2 hours ago. Richard standing next to a gleaming red Ferrari, keys dangling from his fingers, with the caption, "New life, new toys. Better life can be. #upgrade complete. #no looking back. #blessed beyond measure." Isabella stared at that last hashtag, #no looking back, and felt something fundamental break inside her chest. He wasn't just leaving them behind, he was actively celebrating their absence. She wasn't a beloved daughter he was tragically forced to abandon for business reasons. She was dead weight he was thrilled to finally dump. "Mommy," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "I think Daddy got a new little girl." Maria's sharp intake of breath confirmed what Isabella had already begun to suspect. In every photo, every story, every carefully crafted post, there was no trace of the life Richard had shared with them. No mention of a daughter, no hint of a previous marriage, no acknowledgement that he'd ever been anything other than a successful bachelor, living his best life with his perfect girlfriend. He'd erased them completely, as if 9 years of marriage and a daughter who adored him were nothing more than an embarrassing rough draft of the life he'd always meant to live. "Why doesn't he love me anymore?" Isabella asked, her small voice breaking on the words that would haunt Maria's dreams for years to come. Maria turned the laptop away, pulling her daughter into a fierce embrace that couldn't quite cover the sound of both their hearts shattering. Outside their modest apartment window, the world continued turning. People continued living their normal lives. But inside their small kitchen, a mother and daughter began to understand that they were completely, utterly alone. The man who had once been husband and father was gone, replaced by someone who not only didn't want them, but seemed actively disgusted by their very existence. And somewhere in a penthouse across town, that same man was probably posting another story about his upgraded life, never once thinking about the two people whose love he'd discarded like yesterday's trash. The law office of Peterson, Williams and Associates smelled like leather and expensive cologne, a sharp contrast to the discount store perfume Maria had dabbed on her wrists that morning, the only fragrance she could afford since Richard had frozen their joint bank accounts 3 days after his midnight departure. Isabella sat in an oversized chair in the reception area, her legs dangling several inches from the floor, clutching a coloring book and trying to pretend she couldn't hear the muffled conversation coming from behind the heavy oak door. "Mrs. Martinez," Attorney James Peterson had said when they'd first shaken hands, his weathered face creased with the kind of sympathy that came from witnessing too many family destructions. "I have to be honest with you. In 30 years of family law, I've rarely seen such an immediate and aggressive response from opposing counsel." Maria had nodded, though her hands trembled as she sister represented 2 months of careful budgeting, but Peterson had been the only lawyer willing to take payments. Through the door's thick wood, Isabella could hear fragments of conversation that made her small stomach twist into knots. Complete financial cutoff. Hired Steinberg, Morrison and Associates. They're claiming no legal obligation. Contest every single request. Isabella tried to focus on coloring a butterfly purple and gold, the color she would have worn in her school play if everything hadn't fallen apart. But the grown-up words kept seeping through her concentration like poison through cracks in a wall. When the door finally opened, her mother emerged, looking like she'd aged 5 years in the span of an hour. Peterson followed, his expression grim as he glanced down at Isabella with the careful look adults gave children when they were trying to hide how bad things really were. "Isabella, sweetie, we need to go," Maria said, her voice artificially bright in the way that always meant she was trying not to cry in front of her daughter. In the car, their reliable but increasingly concerning Honda that had started making new and troubling noises, Maria tried to explain the unexplainable. "Daddy's lawyers sent some papers," she began carefully, gripping the steering wheel so tightly her knuckles turned white. "They're saying that Daddy doesn't think he should have to help take care of you anymore." Isabella's coloring book slipped from her lap. "But I'm his daughter. Aren't daddies supposed to take care of their little girls?" "Yes, baby, they are." Maria's voice cracked on the words. "But sometimes the law gets complicated and we have to fight to make sure the right thing happens." What Maria couldn't bring herself to explain was the devastating contents of the legal documents that had arrived that morning like a declaration of war. Richard's high-powered legal team, a firm that charged more per hour than Maria made in a week, had filed papers claiming that his previous domestic arrangement had been informal and temporary. They argued that since his financial circumstances had changed dramatically due to his business success, he should not be held to the lifestyle expectations of his former situation. In plain English, Richard was claiming that Isabella and Maria had never really been his family, just a temporary convenience he'd outgrown.
The most heartbreaking part was the timing. Even as Richard's lawyers filed documents claiming he couldn't afford basic child support, his Instagram stories showed him buying a $50,000 watch just because it's Tuesday. While they argued in court that Isabella's private school tuition was an unreasonable expense, Richard posted videos of himself and Amber shopping for a third luxury car because a girl needs options. "Mommy, are we poor now?" Isabella
Market, where they used to shop together as a family. Maria turned off the engine and sat in silence for a moment, watching other families go about their normal Tuesday afternoon errands. "We're going to be very careful with money for a while," she said finally, "but we have each other, and that's what matters most." Inside the store, Maria mentally calculated every purchase, choosing generic brands and counting coupons, while Isabella walked beside her with the solemn awareness that their old life was never coming back. When they reached the checkout line, Maria's credit card was declined, and she had to put back the name-brand cereal Isabella loved, replacing it with a store brand that tasted like cardboard but cost $3 less. That night, as Maria tucked Isabella into bed, her daughter asked the question that had been building all day. "Mommy, why does Daddy have money for fancy cars, but not for my school lunch account?" Maria's heart shattered into smaller pieces, pieces she hadn't even known still existed. How do you explain to a 9-year-old that her father values his girlfriend's shopping sprees more than his daughter's education? How do you find words for cruelty so calculated it defies human comprehension? "I don't know, sweetheart," Maria whispered, smoothing Isabella's hair back from her forehead, "but I promise you, we're going to fight for what's right. Mr. Peterson is going to help us make sure Daddy takes care of you the way he's supposed to." But even as she spoke the words, Maria felt the crushing weight of reality settling on her shoulders. Richard had unlimited resources, an army of expensive lawyers, and apparently no conscience whatsoever. They had an overworked family attorney who charged reasonable rates because he genuinely cared about children, and a mother's desperate love that felt increasingly powerless against the machinery of legal warfare. As Isabella drifted off to sleep, Maria sat at their small kitchen table with a calculator and a pile of bills, trying to figure out how to pay for groceries and legal fees and keep the lights on, all while competing against a man who spent more on a single dinner than they had to live on for a month. Outside, somewhere in his gleaming penthouse, Richard was probably planning his next Instagram post, completely oblivious to the devastation he'd left in his wake. He had successfully erased his old life and was building his new one on the foundation of his daughter's broken heart. The fight for Isabella's future was just beginning, and they were already losing. Isabella had always loved Thursdays because they meant fish sticks for lunch at school and movie night at home. But this particular Thursday morning began with a discovery that would haunt her dreams for months to come. She was hurrying toward the front door, her backpack bouncing against her small frame as she called out to her mother about forgetting her math homework, when she nearly stepped on the manila envelope that had been slipped under their apartment door sometime during the night. "Mommy, there's mail on the floor," Isabella called, bending down to pick up the envelope with the innocent curiosity of a 9-year-old who had never learned to be suspicious of unexpected packages. But the moment her fingers touched the envelope, She knew something was terribly wrong. The paper felt warm and strange, and there was an acrid smell that made her nose wrinkle in instinctive disgust. When she opened it, her small hands trembling, without understanding why, the contents spilled across their hardwood floor like a nightmare. Photos. Dozens of them. But not just any photos, their photos. Pictures from their life together as a family. Memories that had been carefully preserved in albums and frames throughout their modest apartment. Only now, every single image had been systematically destroyed, burned around the edges until the flames had consumed everything beautiful, leaving only charred remnants of what had once been pure joy. There was their last Christmas morning, Isabella's face glowing with excitement as she tore open presents. Richard's genuine smile as he helped her assemble a complicated Lego set. Maria laughing in the background, wearing the ridiculous reindeer sweater Isabella had picked out for her. But now, the flames had eaten away at their faces, leaving only ghostly silhouettes where their happiness used to be. Her 9th birthday party appeared in the pile. The small celebration in their living room, where Maria had made her favorite strawberry cake from scratch, and Richard had spent hours setting up an elaborate treasure hunt that led to a new bicycle waiting in the garage. In the original photo, Isabella had been beaming as she blew out her candles, surrounded by the two people who loved her most in the world. But the burned version showed only the outline of her small body, her face completely consumed by deliberate flame, as if someone had wanted to erase her very existence. Their summer vacation to the lake last year materialized from the pile of destruction. The three of them building sandcastles, Richard teaching Isabella to skip stones, while Maria captured every precious moment on camera. They had been so happy that week, so completely content in their simple family bubble. But now, even those memories had been violated, burned beyond recognition, until only fragments remained. "Why would someone burn our pictures, Mommy?" Isabella's voice came out as barely a whisper, her hands shaking as she held up a photograph of herself as a toddler, taking her first steps directly in their family's memories, holding burned photographs with the shell-shocked expression of a war victim. For a moment, Maria's mind simply refused to process what she was seeing. Who would do such a thing? Who could be so deliberately, systematically cruel? But even as the questions raced through her mind, she knew the answer. Richard might not have lit the matches himself, but his fingerprints were all over this psychological warfare. This wasn't random vandalism or teenage mischief. This was a calculated attack designed to terrorize a mother and child who had already lost everything. "Don't touch any more of them, sweetheart," Maria said, her voice remarkably steady despite the panic clawing at her throat. "Let Mommy handle this." Isabella nodded obediently, but her eyes remained fixed on the destroyed photographs, her 9-year-old mind struggling to comprehend why someone would want to hurt pictures of her family. These weren't just images on paper. They were proof that she had once been loved, that her family had once been real and whole and happy. And now someone had deliberately tried to erase that proof, to make her question whether those golden days had ever existed at all. Maria gathered the burned photographs with shaking hands, her heart breaking anew with each destroyed memory. Someone had gone to incredible lengths to obtain these images. Many of them existed only in her personal albums, photos that weren't posted on social media or shared with anyone outside their immediate family. The level of invasion required to access these pictures was staggering and terrifying. When she called the building's security office, the response was frustratingly predictable. "Oh, Mrs. Martinez, I'm so sorry," the security guard said with genuine regret. "Our cameras went down sometime after midnight. Technical malfunction. We're having the system looked at today." Of course they were. Because in Maria's new reality, coincidences like that were becoming the norm. Security cameras that malfunctioned at precisely the right moment, mail that went missing, phone calls that disconnected at suspicious times. It was as if someone with unlimited resources was systematically dismantling every protection they thought they had. The police officer who responded to Maria's call was polite but dismissive. A tired-looking man who had clearly seen too many domestic disputes and couldn't be bothered to take this one seriously. "Probably just kids playing pranks," he concluded after spending exactly 7 minutes examining the evidence. "You'd be surprised what teenagers will do these days for attention." "Kids?" Maria's voice rose with incredulous anger. "Officer, someone had to break into my personal photo albums to get these pictures. This isn't a prank. This is targeted harassment." But the officer was already closing his notepad, his body language. "Entry, there's not much we can do. I'd suggest maybe talking to your neighbors. See if anyone saw anything suspicious." That night, Isabella couldn't sleep. Every creak of their old building, every footstep in the hallway, every distant car door slamming sent her heart racing with terror. She lay rigid in her narrow bed, staring at the ceiling and jumping at shadows that seemed to move with malevolent purpose. The burned photographs had done exactly what they were designed to do: strip away her sense of safety and replace it with constant, gnawing fear. When she finally did drift off near dawn, her dreams were filled with faceless figures setting fire to everything she loved, watching with satisfaction as her childhood memories turned to ash and blew away on a wind that smelled like smoke and malice. The next morning, as they walked to school together, Isabella couldn't stop looking over her shoulder. Every stranger on the street seemed potentially dangerous. Every parked car might contain someone watching them. Every shadow could hide a threat. Her 9-year-old world had been transformed overnight, from a place of relative safety to a hunting ground where she and her mother were the prey. "Mommy," she whispered as they reached the school gates, "are we going to be okay?" Maria knelt down and pulled her daughter into a fierce hug, breathing in the familiar scent of her strawberry shampoo and trying to absorb some of her child's remaining innocence. "We're going to be fine, baby," she lied with all the conviction she could muster. "Mommy's going to figure this out." But as she watched Isabella disappear into the school building, shoulders hunched with new anxiety, Maria felt the first real cracks forming in her determination. Whoever was behind this campaign of terror wasn't going to stop with burned photographs. This was just the beginning, and she had no idea how much worse things were about to get. The call came during Maria's lunch break 3 days after the photograph incident, her supervisor's voice tight with concern as she summoned Maria to the front office. "There are some men here asking questions about Isabella," she said quietly. "They claim to be educational consultants, but something feels off about them." Maria's blood turned to ice water as she hurried through the elementary school's cheerfully decorated hallways, past bulletin boards covered with children's artwork and motivational posters that suddenly seemed obscenely innocent. Through the office's glass doors, she could see 2 men in expensive suits that probably cost more than she made in 3 months. Their presence so out of place in the modest school that they might as well have been wearing neon signs advertising their true purpose. "Mrs. Martinez?" The taller man extended his hand, with a smile that never reached his eyes. "I'm Jonathan Pierce from Educational Excellence Associates. We're conducting a comprehensive review of gifted student programs in the district, and Isabella's name came up as a candidate for some exciting opportunities. Everything about him screamed professional intimidation, from his perfectly styled hair to his Italian leather shoes that clicked authoritatively against the school's worn linoleum floors. His companion, a shorter man with dead eyes and the build of someone who had spent time in places where violence was commonplace, said nothing, but watched Maria with the focused attention of a predator studying its prey. "What kind of opportunities?" Maria asked, though every instinct she possessed was screaming danger. "Private tutoring programs, advanced placement options, scholarship opportunities for exceptional students whose families might be experiencing financial transitions." Pierce's smile widened, and Maria caught the deliberate emphasis on those last words. He knew. Of course he knew. These weren't educational consultants. They were Richard's people, gathering intelligence on their targets. Isabella's teacher, Mrs. Peterson, appeared at Maria's elbow with the protective instincts of someone who had spent 20 years learning to recognize wolves in sheep's clothing. "I'm sorry, gentlemen, but we have strict policies about discussing students with outside parties. If you'd like to review our programs, you'll need to go through proper channels with the district office." Pierce's smile never wavered, but something cold flickered behind his eyes. "Of course, we completely understand. We were just hoping to get a sense of Isabella's daily routine. What time she arrives, when she has recess, her after-school schedule. Purely for program planning purposes, you understand." The hair on the back of Maria's neck stood up. They weren't asking about Isabella's academic performance or intellectual capabilities. They wanted her schedule. They wanted to know when and where they could find a 9-year-old girl who had already been terrorized in her own home. "I think this meeting is over," Maria said, her voice stronger than she felt. "If you have legitimate business with our school, you can contact the principal directly." As the two men left, Pierce paused at the door and turned back with that same cold smile. "Please give Isabella our regards," he said. "We'll be seeing her around." The threat was barely veiled, delivered with the casual confidence of someone who knew he operated beyond the reach of normal consequences. Maria watched through the office window as they climbed into a black sedan with tinted windows, the kind of car that belonged to people who preferred to remain invisible while they destroyed other people's lives. That afternoon, as Maria walked to her own car after picking up Isabella from her after-school program, she noticed the black roses immediately. A dozen of them, their petals so dark they seemed to absorb light. A rain shake. Drop the case or face consequences. This is your only warning. Isabella was chattering about her day, blissfully unaware of the latest escalation in their nightmare, when Maria spotted the flowers. "Wait here, sweetie," she said, trying to keep her voice light. "Mommy needs to check something." But as she approached her car, Maria realized the roses weren't the only violation. Her driver's side door was slightly ajar, not much, just enough to suggest that someone had been inside. Her glove compartment hung open, its contents scattered. Someone had gone through her personal belongings, her registration, her insurance papers, her emergency contact information. They wanted her to know that nowhere was safe, that they could reach her anywhere, anytime. "Mommy, why are there flowers on our car?" Isabella asked, her voice small with new anxiety. "I don't know, baby," Maria lied, quickly gathering the roses and shoving them into a nearby dumpster before Isabella could read the threatening note. Probably just someone who got confused about which car was theirs. But Isabella was 9, not stupid, and the past week had already taught her to recognize when the adults in her life were trying to protect her from terrible truths. She said nothing, but Maria caught her daughter checking the locks on their apartment door 3 times that night and testing the windows to make sure they were secure. The phone call came at 2:17 a.m., jarring them both awake with its shrill electronic cry. Maria's heart was already pounding as she reached for the receiver, knowing with sick certainty that nothing good ever came from middle-of-the-night phone calls. "We know where you live," the voice said, without preamble. It was electronically distorted, artificially deepened, to sound like something from a horror movie, but the message was crystal clear. "We know where Isabella goes to school. We know her teacher's name, her friends' names, the route she takes to the playground. We know everything." Maria's blood turned to ice as the voice continued with methodical precision. "We know you stop at Miller's Market every Tuesday after work. We know you do laundry at the basement facility every Sunday morning. We know Isabella has dance class on Thursdays at 4 p.m. We know about the nightlight in her bedroom and the stuffed elephant she sleeps with." The level of detail was staggering and terrifying. Someone had been watching them for weeks, cataloging their every movement, learning their routines with the thoroughness of a military surveillance operation. The invasion of privacy was so complete it made Maria feel physically sick. "What do you want?" she whispered into the phone, though she already knew the answer. "Stop fighting for what you think you..." With shaking hands. In the bed beside her, Isabella pretended to be asleep, but Maria could see the tension in her small body, could hear the change in her breathing that meant she'd heard every word. The next morning, Maria made a decision that felt like admitting defeat, but was actually an act of desperate self-preservation. She called in sick to work and spent the day installing security cameras around their apartment, changing their routines, mapping out alternate routes to school and work. She bought new locks, blackout curtains, and a prepaid cell phone that only she and Isabella's school would know about. Isabella watched these preparations with the solemn understanding of a child who had learned too young that the world was not a safe place. "Are we hiding from the bad people, Mommy?" she asked, as Maria tested the new deadbolt for the 3rd time. "We're just being extra careful," Maria replied, but they both knew she was lying. They weren't just being careful, they were under siege. And somewhere, in his gleaming penthouse, Richard was probably sleeping peacefully, completely unconcerned about the terror campaign being waged in his name against the daughter who had once been the center of his universe. The hunters were closing in, and Maria was running out of places to hide. The scratching sound that woke Isabella at 3:42 a.m. was soft at first, barely audible above the ambient noise of their aging apartment building. In her sleep-fogged state, she almost dismissed it as a tree branch against the window, or perhaps a neighbor's cat exploring the fire escape. But as consciousness crept in, bringing with it the hyper-vigilance that had become her constant companion over the past 2 weeks, Isabella realized the sound was too rhythmic, too deliberate to be natural. Scratch, scratch, scratch. Someone was outside her second-floor bedroom window, deliberately dragging something sharp across the glass with the methodical precision of someone who wanted to be heard. Isabella's small body went rigid with terror as she lay perfectly still in her narrow bed, clutching Peanuts, the elephant, so tightly that her knuckles turned white in the darkness. The scratching continued for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes. Long, deliberate strokes that seemed designed to carve fear directly into a 9-year-old's soul. When it finally stopped, the silence that followed was somehow even more terrifying than the sound itself. Isabella waited, barely breathing. Image of a little girl, stick-figure arms and legs, pigtails represented by simple lines, even a small dress that looked disturbingly similar to Isabella's favorite school outfit. And around the stick-figure girl, scratched with equal precision, were larger figures that seemed to be closing in, their arms reaching toward the child in the center with obvious malevolent intent. "Mommy!" Isabella's scream tore through the apartment like a siren, raw with terror and confusion. "Mommy!" Maria burst through the bedroom door, looking like she'd aged a decade overnight, her hair disheveled and dark circles under her eyes, testament to the fact that she hadn't been sleeping well either. But when she saw the window, when she took in the full scope of this latest violation, the careful composure she'd been maintaining for Isabella's sake finally cracked like an eggshell. "Oh, God," she whispered, her hands flying to her mouth as she stared at the scratched messages. "Oh, my God, they were right outside your window. They were inches from you while you slept." The realization hit them both simultaneously. Whoever had done this had climbed up to the second floor, had spent time outside Isabella's bedroom in the middle of the night, had been close enough to reach through the glass and touch a sleeping child. The level of violation, of deliberate psychological torture, was so complete that it defied comprehension. Isabella watched her mother's face cycle through emotions: fear, rage, despair, and finally something that looked like complete defeat. Maria sank onto the edge of Isabella's bed, her whole body shaking as the enormity of their situation crashed over her like a tsunami. "I can't do this anymore," Maria whispered, more to herself than to Isabella. "I don't know how to protect you from this. I don't know how to fight people who have unlimited money and no conscience. I don't know how to keep you safe when they can get this close to you while you're sleeping." For a moment, Isabella saw her mother not as the strong, protective force she'd always been, but as what she really was, a scared woman, facing an enemy with resources and ruthlessness she couldn't match. Maria's hands covered her face as sobs began to shake her shoulders, the kind of deep, wrenching cries that came from someone who had reached the absolute end of their ability to cope. But something remarkable happened in that moment of her mother's complete breakdown. Isabella, who had been the victim, the protected one, the child who needed shelter from this storm, found a strength she didn't know she possessed. She slipped out of her bed and wrapped her small arms around her mother's shaking shoulders, offering comfort with the wisdom of someone far older than 9. "It's okay, Mommy," Isabella said softly, her voice steady despite her own terror. "We're brave together, remember? You told me that. We don't have to be brave alone. We just have to be brave together." Maria looked up at her daughter through her tears, seeing something in Isabella's young face that took her breath away. This child, who had every right to be consumed with fear and despair, was choosing instead to be a source of strength. In the face of deliberate cruelty designed to break her spirit, Isabella was revealing a core of steel that no amount of intimidation could touch. "You're right, baby," Maria said, wiping her eyes and feeling something shift inside her chest. "We are brave together. And brave people don't give up, do they? No, Isabella said firmly. Brave people ask for help when they need it. Those words, spoken with the innocent wisdom of a child who had learned too much too young, became Maria's lifeline. She spent the rest of that morning on the phone, calling every police department in the city, every detective agency she could find in the yellow pages, every resource she could think of that might take their situation seriously. Most of the calls went nowhere. Domestic dispute, they said. Civil matter, they concluded. Not enough evidence for criminal charges, they explained with practiced indifference. But Maria kept calling, kept explaining, kept begging someone, anyone, to understand that a little girl was being terrorized by people with enough money to operate above the law. Finally, on her 17th call of the day, a receptionist at the city's Special Victims Unit said something that made Maria's heart skip a beat. "Hold on, let me transfer you to Detective Walsh. She specializes in cases involving children and domestic terrorism." The voice that came on the line was crisp, professional, but with an underlying warmth that immediately set it apart from all the dismissive officials Maria had spoken to that day. "This is Detective Sarah Walsh. I understand you and your daughter are receiving threats?" "Yes," Maria said, surprised to find herself crying again. "They scratched messages on my daughter's bedroom window last night. They've been watching us, following us, sending us burned photographs. My ex-husband hired lawyers who cost more per hour than I make in a month, and I think they're trying to scare us into dropping our custody case." There was a pause, and then Detective Walsh said something that made Maria sink to her knees with relief. "Mrs. Martinez, I want you to know that I believe you. What you're describing is systematic intimidation and harassment, and no child should have to live in fear like this. Can you and Isabella come in today? I'd like to hear the whole story. And I have a partner who's very good at finding evident adult faces for signs of good or bad news." Maria felt the first stirrings of something that felt almost like confidence. "We're going to meet someone today who's going to help us," she told Isabella. "A detective who specializes in protecting children from bad people." Isabella nodded solemnly, then asked the question that proved she understood far more about their situation than any 9-year-old should have to. "Does she have a gun?" "Yes, sweetheart, she does." "Good," Isabella said with satisfaction, "because I think we're going to need it." Outside, somewhere in the shadows that had become their constant companions, the watchers continued their surveillance. But for the first time since this nightmare began, Maria and Isabella weren't facing them alone. Help was finally coming, and it arrived in the form of a detective who understood that some battles required more than just hope and determination. They required someone willing to fight fire with fire. The precinct bullpen at 3 p.m. on a Tuesday afternoon buzzed with the controlled chaos that marked the changing of shifts, detectives wrapping up cases, uniforms filing reports, phones ringing with the endless stream of human misery that defined police work. But at desk 47, in the corner where the fluorescent lights cast everything in harsh relief, Detective Sarah Walsh sat in an island of focused calm, her weathered hands methodically reviewing a case file that had kept her awake for the past 3 nights. At 42, Sarah had the kind of face that criminals remembered in their nightmares: sharp cheekbones, steel gray eyes that missed nothing, and a mouth that could shift from maternal compassion to lethal authority in the space of a heartbeat. 15 years on the force had carved lines around those eyes, but they were the right kind of lines, the ones that came from squinting at evidence boards until the connections became clear, from staying up all night because someone's daughter was missing, from refusing to give up when everyone else had written off a case as unsolvable. The wall behind her desk told the story of those 15 years in newspaper clippings, commendations, and thank-you letters from families whose lives she'd helped rebuild. Walsh Brake's organized crime ring from the Tribune. Detectives' persistence solves cold case murder from the Herald. But it was the smaller headlines that mattered more to Sarah, the ones about missing children found, about corrupt officials brought to justice, about seemingly impossible cases that she'd refused to let die. Her specialty was the cases other detectives wouldn't touch, the ones where the perpetrators had money, power, and enough lawyers to bury evidence in bureaucratic quicksand, politicians who thought their connections made them untouchable, businessmen who believed their wealth put them above the law, and always, the victims who thought no one would believe lived in the right neighborhoods. Sarah understood those victims because she had been one of them. 20 years ago, she'd been Sarah Patterson, married to a successful investment banker who controlled every aspect of her life with the methodical precision of a chess grandmaster. David Patterson had never hit her. He was too smart for that. Instead, he'd systematically isolated her from friends and family, monitored her every movement, and made her question her own sanity with a campaign of psychological warfare that left no physical evidence but destroyed her from the inside out. The day she'd finally found the courage to leave, David had smiled his charming smile and made her a promise. "No one will ever believe you. I'll make sure of that. And if you think you can take anything that belongs to me, including yourself, you'll discover just how wrong you are." He'd been true to his word. The legal battle that followed had nearly broken her, but it had also forged her into something harder and more determined than she'd ever imagined possible. When the dust settled and David's true nature was finally exposed, Sarah had two things: a divorce decree and a burning need to make sure no other woman ever faced what she'd endured alone. The police academy had welcomed her with the kind of skepticism reserved for career changers who thought they understood what police work really meant. But Sarah had something most recruits lacked: a bone-deep understanding of how predators operated, how they used the system against their victims, and how they counted on that system to protect them when their victims finally fought back. Her partner, Duke, lay beside her desk, 90 pounds of German Shepherd intelligence wrapped in a deceptively calm exterior. To most people, Duke looked like a standard K-9 unit, well-trained, obedient, impressive, but unremarkable. But Sarah had learned over their 5 years together that Duke possessed something far beyond standard police dog training. He read people with an accuracy that bordered on supernatural, sensing lies and danger and hidden truths with an instinct that had never once led them astray. Duke had been a rescue, found half-starved and traumatized in an abandoned warehouse where a dog-fighting ring had been operating. The department's K-9 unit had almost written him off as too damaged for police work. But Sarah had seen something in his dark eyes that reminded her of her own journey from victim to survivor. She'd fought for months to be allowed to train with him. And their partnership had become the stuff of precinct legend. When the call came in about Maria Martinez and her daughter, Sarah's first instinct was the same weary skepticism that greeted most domestic cases. Divorced spouse making allegations. Custody battle getting ugly. Standard Tuesday afternoon in the life of a family court system that ground up innocent children with the efficiency of an industrial machine. But something in Maria's voice, that initial phone call, had made Sarah pause. It wasn't the usual anger or bitterness that characterized most custody disputes. It was fear. pure, unadulterated terror that came from someone who knew they were being hunted by something much more dangerous than an angry ex-husband. "Detective Walsh?" The desk sergeant's voice cut through her concentration. "The Martinez family is here." Sarah looked up to see a woman and child approaching her desk, and her professional skepticism began to crack the moment she saw them. Maria Martinez moved with the hypervigilant wariness of someone who had learned to scan every room for potential threats. Her protective instincts so heightened that Sarah could practically feel them radiating across the bullpen. But it was the little girl who made Sarah's breath catch in her throat. Isabella Martinez was 9 years old, but her eyes held the kind of premature wisdom that came from witnessing too much adult cruelty too young. She walked close to her mother's side, not with the casual confidence of a child who felt safe, but with the calculated awareness of someone who had learned that danger could come from anywhere, at any time. Her small hand never left her mother's arm, and her gaze swept the police station with the methodical attention of a tiny soldier surveying a battlefield. "Mrs. Martinez, I'm Detective Walsh." Sarah stood and extended her hand, noting how Maria's grip trembled slightly, and how Isabella positioned herself to keep both Sarah and the exit in her line of sight. But it was what happened next that transformed Sarah's professional interest into personal commitment. Duke, who had been lying quietly beside Sarah's desk, suddenly lifted his head and focused every ounce of his attention on Isabella. His ears perked forward, his tail gave a small wag, and he rose slowly to his feet, with the careful movements he reserved for the most vulnerable victims they encountered. Isabella's eyes widened as she spotted the large German shepherd, but instead of fear, Sarah saw something else in the child's expression. Recognition. Not of Duke specifically, but of a kindred spirit who understood what it meant to survive in a world where predators wore human faces. "This is Duke," Sarah said softly, watching as the dog approached Isabella with unusual gentleness. "He's very good at helping people who are scared." Isabella looked up at her mother for permission, then slowly extended her small hand toward Duke. The moment their skin made contact, Sarah saw something shift in both of them. Duke's usual professional reserve melted into protective warmth, while Isabella's tense shoulders relaxed for the first time since she'd entered the building. "He likes me," Isabella whispered, wonder creeping into her voice. Character. As Maria began to recount their story, the abandonment, the legal warfare, the systematic intimidation, Sarah found herself getting angrier with each detail. But it was when Isabella quietly added her own observations that Sarah's professional objectivity completely evaporated. "The men who came to my school weren't really education people," Isabella said, with the matter-of-fact tone of someone stating an obvious truth. "They asked about my schedule, not about my grades, and they smelled like the cologne Daddy started wearing after he got his new girlfriend." In that moment, Sarah realized this wasn't just another custody battle gone ugly. This was a deliberate campaign to terrorize a child, orchestrated by someone with enough resources to hire professionals and enough sociopathy to target his own daughter. Richard Martinez wasn't just abandoning Isabella, he was trying to erase her, to make her disappear so completely that she'd never be able to interfere with his new life. Sarah had seen monsters before, but they usually preyed on strangers. This was something more evil. A father who had decided his own child was an obstacle to be eliminated. "Isabella," Sarah said, her voice gentle but firm. I want you to know that what's happening to you and your mom isn't okay. Adults who try to scare children are bullies, and it's my job to stop bullies. Isabella studied Sarah's face with the intensity of someone who had learned not to trust adult promises easily. Do you think you can stop them? Sarah met the child's gaze directly, seeing herself at 9 years old, wondering if anyone would ever be strong enough to protect her from the monsters in her own life. I don't just think I can stop them, Isabella. I know I can, because I've stopped people like this before, and I won't stop until you're safe. It was a promise Sarah had no business making without knowing the full scope of what they were facing. But looking at Isabella's brave little face and Maria's desperate hope, Sarah felt the familiar fire ignite in her chest, the one that had driven her through the police academy, through 15 years of impossible cases, through every moment when giving up would have been easier than fighting. This case was about to become personal, and Sarah Walsh, at her most personal, was a force of nature that even billionaires with unlimited legal resources would learn to fear. Duke's investigation began the moment Sarah opened the evidence box containing the burned photographs, but what happened next was unlike anything she'd witnessed in their 5 years of partnership. The German shepherd's usual methodical examination of moving his nose following invisible trails across the photographs with the intensity of a bloodhound on a fresh scent. His hackles rose as he examined each burned image, his growl deepening with what Sarah could only describe as anger. In all their years together, she'd never seen him react to evidence with such personal antipathy. "He's upset," Isabella observed from her chair, her small voice cutting through the tension. "The bad smells are making him mad." Sarah looked at the child with new respect. Most adults couldn't read Duke's subtle emotional cues, but Isabella seemed to understand him instinctively. "What kind of bad smells, sweetheart?" "The kind that means someone wanted to hurt our family on purpose," Isabella replied, with devastating accuracy. "Duke knows the difference between accident hurting and mean person hurting." Duke's investigation continued with methodical precision. He examined the envelope the photos had arrived in, his nose detecting layers of scent that painted a picture Sarah's human senses couldn't access. Expensive cologne, cigarette smoke from a specific brand, the lingering chemical signature of professional photography developing solutions, and underneath it all, something that made Duke's protective instincts flare, the scent of calculated malice. "We need to see your apartment," Sarah said, watching Duke's reactions. Duke's picking up traces that suggest these photos were handled by multiple people before they reached you. 20 minutes later, they stood outside the Martinez apartment building while Duke conducted the most thorough investigation Sarah had ever witnessed. His nose led them through the lobby, past the broken security camera that had mysteriously malfunctioned, and up the stairs to the second floor with purposeful determination. But it was in the hallway outside their apartment that Duke made his first major discovery. He stopped beside what appeared to be a completely innocent smoke detector mounted on the ceiling, his body language shifting into the alert stance that meant he'd found something significant. "That smoke detector," Sarah said, her voice tight with realization. "How long has it been there?" Maria looked up, confusion creasing her forehead. I don't know. I never really noticed it before." Sarah borrowed a maintenance ladder from the building's super, and what she found inside the seemingly standard smoke detector made her blood run cold. Professional-grade surveillance equipment, complete with audio recording capabilities and wireless transmission technology that probably cost more than most people's cars. "They've been listening to everything," Sarah said grimly, carefully documenting the device before removing it. "Every conversation, every private moment, every plan you've made to protect yourselves." But Duke wasn't finished. His nose led them to 2 more devices, one hidden in the building's laundry room, another disguised as part of the mailbox array in the lobby. The level of surveillance was staggering, creating a comprehensive intelligence network that would have made professional spies envious. Inside the Martinez apartment, Duke's investigation took on an even more urgent quality. He immediately focused on Isabella's bedroom window, his nose following scent trails that painted a detailed picture of the previous night's violation. Someone had spent considerable time outside that window, long enough to leave multiple scent markers that Duke could differentiate and analyze. Two people, Sarah concluded, watching Duke's movements. One stayed on the fire escape, while the other did the actual window scratching. They were here for at least 30 minutes. Isabella's eyes widened with horrified fascination. They watched me sleep for 30 minutes? Not watched, sweetheart, Sarah said gently. They were working. Duke can tell the difference between watching and working scents. But Duke's most disturbing discovery came when he began following a scent trail that led from Isabella's bedroom window through the apartment and out into the hallway. His nose led them downstairs, through the building's basement, and out to the parking garage where Maria's car was parked. The car that had been invaded, searched, and bugged with the same professional thoroughness as their apartment. Jesus, Sarah breathed, as Duke indicated 3 separate electronic devices hidden in Maria's Honda. They're tracking everywhere you go, recording every conversation you have, monitoring every aspect of your lives. But it was Duke's final discovery that transformed Sarah's anger into something cold and determined. Hidden beneath Maria's car, disguised as part of the exhaust system, was a small device that Sarah recognized with stomach-churning certainty. "What is it?" Maria asked, seeing Sarah's expression. "GPS tracker with remote activation capability," Sarah replied grimly. "The kind that allows someone to monitor your location in real time and disable your vehicle if necessary." The implication hung in the air like toxic smoke. Whoever was orchestrating this campaign of terror wasn't content with psychological warfare. They had the capability to strand Maria and Isabella anywhere, anytime, leaving them vulnerable to whatever came next. Duke's investigation had revealed a surveillance network so comprehensive and professionally executed that it spoke to resources far beyond what most private investigators could provide. This was corporate-level surveillance, the kind employed by governments and major corporations to monitor high-value targets. "The scent trails all lead back to the same source," Sarah said, studying Duke's reactions. "Professional-grade equipment, installed by people who've done this kind of work before. This isn't harassment, Maria. This is systematic intelligence gathering by people who specialize in making problems disappear." As they documented each device, Sarah's phone buzzed with a text from her. "Contact at the FBI's Cybercrime Division. That equipment you sent photos of, it's manufactured by Sentinel Solutions, high-end security company that specializes in corporate espionage and reputation management. Their client list reads like a who's who of people with serious money and flexible ethics." Sarah showed the text to Maria, watching the color drain from her face as the full scope of their situation became clear. "Richard didn't just hire lawyers," Sarah said quietly. "He hired professionals who specialize in making inconvenient people disappear." Isabella, who had been quietly petting Duke while the adults talked, looked up with the solemn wisdom that had become her constant companion. "Are we inconvenient people now?" "You were never inconvenient, sweetheart," Sarah said, kneeling down to Isabella's eye level while Duke positioned himself protectively between the child and the apartment's entrance. "You're a little girl who deserves to feel safe in her own home, and that's exactly what we're going to make sure happens." Duke's soft whine of agreement seemed to seal the promise, and for the first time since this nightmare began, Isabella allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, the good guys really could win. But Sarah knew that what Duke had uncovered was just the beginning. The surveillance network was too sophisticated, too expensive, and too professionally executed to be the work of angry divorce lawyers. They were dealing with people who had unlimited resources and no ethical boundaries. People who saw a 9-year-old girl not as a human being deserving protection, but as a problem requiring elimination. The war for Isabella's future was about to escalate far beyond anything Maria had imagined, and Sarah Walsh was preparing for the fight of her career. Sarah's war room took shape over the next 72 hours, transforming the conference room adjacent to her desk into a command center that would have impressed military strategists. Whiteboards covered every available wall surface, connected by red string that traced the relationships between Richard Martinez, his legal team, Sentinel Solutions, and the growing list of professionals involved in what Sarah had begun calling Operation Erase Isabella. The evidence boxes lined one wall in chronological order: burned photographs, surveillance equipment, recorded threats, financial records that her contacts in various agencies had quietly provided. Each piece of evidence was photographed, catalogued, and cross-referenced with a precision that would make prosecutors weep with joy when this case finally saw the inside of a courtroom. "Tell me about the lawyers again," Sarah said, studying the photograph of Richard's legal team that had been taken outside the family courthouse. Maria sat across from her at the conference table, Isabella coloring quietly in the corner, while Duke maintained his protective vigil nearby. "Steinberg, Morrison, and Associates," Maria replied, her voice carrying the weariness of someone who had been beaten down by expensive legal machinations. "6 lawyers showed up to our first hearing." 6. For a simple child support case. Sarah nodded, making notes on her ever-growing timeline. Her contact at the State Bar Association had provided interesting background information on Steinberg, Morrison, and Associates, a firm that specialized in what they euphemistically called high-stakes family restructuring. Translation: they helped wealthy men dispose of inconvenient families with minimal financial impact. Their retainer alone probably cost more than your annual salary, Sarah observed, which raises the question of why Richard would spend that kind of money to avoid paying basic child support. It was a question that had been nagging at Sarah since she'd begun building the case. The amount Richard was spending on legal fees and surveillance already exceeded what a reasonable child support settlement would cost by a factor of 10. This wasn't about money. It was about something far more sinister. Isabella looked up from her coloring, her young voice cutting through the adult conversation with uncomfortable clarity. "Daddy doesn't want me to exist anymore." The simple statement hung in the air like a physical presence, stripping away all the legal complexity and professional terminology to reveal the ugly truth at the center of their case. Richard Martinez wasn't just abandoning his daughter. He was actively working to erase every trace of her from his life. "Sweetheart," Sarah said gently, "what makes you say that?" Isabella set down her purple crayon and considered the question with the seriousness of someone much older than 9. "When Daddy got his new life, he didn't just leave us. He threw away our pictures and pretended we never happened. Now, he's trying to make everyone else forget about us too." Sarah exchanged a look with Maria, seeing her own realization reflected in the mother's eyes. Isabella had articulated what Sarah's professional instincts had been telling her. This wasn't a custody battle. It was an elimination campaign. "The financial records you requested came through," Sarah said, sliding a folder across the table to Maria. "Richard's spending patterns are interesting," The documents painted a picture of systematic preparation for total life erasure. Richard had spent over $200,000 in the past month alone, not just on lawyers and surveillance, but on what could only be described as identity reconstruction. New Social Security cards claiming he'd never been married, retroactive name changes on property deeds, financial and the right lawyers. You can retroactively restructure a lot of legal documents. Ethically, it's monstrous. And criminally, the surveillance and intimidation definitely cross several lines. Sarah's phone buzzed with a text from Detective Rodriguez in Financial Crimes. Sentinel Solutions has interesting corporate structure, shell companies all the way down. But the contracts you found trace back to someone very familiar with Richard's personal details. Inside job. Sarah showed the text to Maria, watching understanding dawn in her eyes. Someone close to Richard is feeding information to the surveillance team. Someone who knows your routines, Isabella's schedule, your personal habits. His assistant, Maria said suddenly. Jennifer, she's worked for Richard for 3 years. She knows everything about our family, where Isabella goes to school, her after-school activities, our grocery shopping habits. She even has keys to our apartment from when Richard needed to grab things during his business trips. The pieces were clicking into place with sickening clarity. Richard hadn't just hired outside professionals to terrorize his family. He'd weaponized someone they'd trusted, someone who had been welcomed into their home and given access to their most private information. Isabella, who had been listening with the focused attention that had become her survival mechanism, asked the question that made Sarah's blood run cold. Does that mean Jennifer knows I'm here right now? Sarah's answer came in the form of immediate action. She was on her phone within seconds, calling in favors from every contact she'd developed over 15 years of police work. I need a safe house, she said without preamble. Mother and child, potential immediate threat, professional surveillance network. Duke's sudden alertness provided the punctuation to her urgency. The German shepherd rose to his feet, his ears pricked forward as he focused on something beyond the conference room windows. His low growl was barely audible, but Sarah had learned to trust his instincts completely. We need to move, Sarah said, her voice carrying the authority that had made her legend among her colleagues. Duke sensing something. Isabella, can you pack your coloring book quickly? As they prepared to leave, Sarah made Isabella a promise that would define every decision she made for the rest of this case. No one should have to be afraid in their own home, sweetheart. Not you, not your mom, not anyone. And I'm going to make sure that the people who tried to scare you learn that hurting children has consequences. Isabella looked up at Sarah with eyes that held too much knowledge for someone so young, but also something that hadn't been there when they'd first met. Hope. Will Duke come with us to the safe place? Duke goes everywhere I go, Sarah replied, watching as Isabella's small hand found the German shepherd's fur. And right now, my job is making sure you and your mom are safe. As they gathered their essential belongings and prepared to leave the precinct, Sarah caught a glimpse of herself in the conference room's window reflection. She looked exactly like what she was. A cop who had found her line in the sand and was prepared to defend it with everything she had. Richard Martinez had made the mistake of targeting a child, and that child had found her way to the one detective in the city who understood exactly what it meant to be hunted by someone with unlimited resources and no conscience. The war was about to begin in earnest, and Sarah Walsh had never lost a war when a child's safety was at stake. The hunt for justice was officially underway. Hamilton County Family Courthouse had seen countless custody battles, but few as lopsided as the one in courtroom 3B that Tuesday. Maria Martinez sat beside her modestly dressed attorney, James Peterson, his worn briefcase a badge of a man who fought for justice, not profit. Across the aisle, Richard Martinez commanded 6 lawyers from Steinberg, Morrison, and Associates. Charcoal Armani suits, Italian briefcases, and the cold precision of a corporate army. Leading them was Margaret Steinberg, silver-haired and razor-sharp. But it was Richard's transformation that struck his 9-year-old daughter Isabella, artist. Gone was the rumpled tech dad who taught her circuits in the garage. Now he was sleek, confident, in a Tom Ford suit and Patek Philippe watch, scanning the courtroom without once meeting her eyes. When she whispered to Sarah Walsh, "Why won't Daddy look at me?" Sarah's reply was quiet but firm. Sometimes people forget what's important, but that doesn't change how important you are. The proceedings began like a siege. Motions, counterclaims, and accusations painting Maria as unstable. Judge Patricia Williams worked to keep order, as Peterson struggled to keep pace. Richard's testimony was cold, calling his past with Maria a domestic arrangement during financial uncertainty. To him, fatherhood was a business deal long past its use. His legal team framed his success as reason to cut obligations. Maria's turn brought raw emotion. He was a loving father for 9 years. She waited by the window every night for him. Richard's face stayed blank. Then Sarah Walsh rose with evidence from an ongoing criminal investigation. Richard's social media aligned with his court filings. Projected on the screen, Richard, beside, coincided with filing to end her dance classes. A $200,000 Lamborghini purchase matched a move to stop her therapy. The room grew still. Even Richard's lawyers shifted uncomfortably. Finally, Judge Williams looked at the little girl clutching a photo in the gallery. Breaking with standard practice, she invited Isabella to testify. Steinberg objected. Williams overruled. Isabella, in her spring concert dress, climbed into the witness chair, feet not touching the floor. Asked why she was there, she said simply, "We're trying to make Daddy take care of me, like daddies are supposed to." She spoke of the best daddy in the whole world, teaching her computers, calling her his little engineer, making up stories of princesses who solve problems with science. Her voice dimmed when she described the day the phone rang and made Daddy's eyes turn into dollar signs, after which he treated her and Mommy like old toys he didn't want to play with anymore. Looking at her father, she asked, "If I was really his treasure, like he always said, why did he put me in the garbage when he found new toys?" Gasps rippled through the room. She told him she still loved the daddy who once taught her circuits. "I'm sorry I wasn't good enough to keep," she said, "but please, don't make me disappear completely. I still need a daddy until I'm old enough to take care of myself." By the time she stepped down, the courtroom was silent except for muffled attempts to hold back tears. Richard sat frozen, confronted with the cost of his choices. The legal battle wasn't over, but in that moment everyone knew exactly who Isabella was and exactly what her father had chosen to throw away. Judge Williams knew, too, what her decision would be. Thursday morning, Duke's behavior was unlike anything Sarah had seen in their 5 years together. The German Shepherd paced the precinct's lot, nostrils flaring toward downtown's steel towers, ignoring her attempts to steer him toward their planned witness interview. Finally, he trotted to her personal car, posture urgent. Sarah knew better than to ignore him. 20 minutes later, they stood outside One Financial Plaza, a 40-story monument to corporate power. Duke bypassed the main entrance, focusing instead on a discreet door, Harbor Point Consulting, Suite 847. The name meant nothing to Sarah, but Duke's intensity said otherwise. A call to Detective Lisa Chen in financial crimes brought answers that chilled her. Harbor Point was no ordinary consulting firm. It specialized in reputation management for the wealthy and trouble, hiding assets, burying scandals, and making problems vanish. Chen laid out the real bombshell. Harbor Point had been receiving payments from Richard Martinez's company, NeuralSync Technologies, for months, matching the timeline. Revolutionary AI was stolen from a former employer, its government contracts obtained through bribery. Richard's wealth wasn't just tainted, it was criminal. Invoices for security services tied to Richard's legal team matched the intimidation campaign against Maria. Duke's reactions to certain documents made Sarah realize they weren't just harassing. They were destroying evidence and silencing witnesses. Sarah called the FBI. Agent Patricia Martinez didn't mince words. "Detective, this isn't a custody dispute. It's a RICO case hiding in family court. Richard was using stolen tech, laundering money offshore, bribing officials, and weaponizing a network of lawyers, consultants, and private investigators to erase his own daughter from his life. And the legal record." That night, Duke woke Sarah with restless pacing. He led her to the precinct's evidence locker and fixated on the packing materials from surveillance devices planted in Maria's home. Cross-referencing the shipping info with court filings revealed the smoking gun. The devices had been purchased by Steinberg, Morrison and Associates, Richard's own attorneys. With FBI wiretap help, Sarah uncovered a vast web of corruption. Witness tampering, teachers bribed or threatened to testify against Maria, evidence planting, plans to put drugs and forged financial papers in Maria's apartment, jury manipulation, leaked strategies, rigged jury pools, character assassination, fake social media posts painting Maria as unstable, Isabella as manipulative. Worst was Richard's voice on a call. "The girl is the weak link. Prove she's damaged. Terminate parental rights. Erase them both. Complete erasure." Court clerks, CPS workers, even building security were on Harbor Point's payroll. Every delay in Maria's case had been deliberate sabotage. Online, fake accounts smeared Isabella so thoroughly that her classmates, parents, and teachers could have believed the lies. Sarah realized Maria and Isabella had been fighting a war they could never win. The system itself had been turned against them. But now they had proof. In Agent Martinez's 23rd floor office, the pieces clicked together. "In 15 years, I've never seen a RICO case start with a custody fight," she said. Richard's theft from Quantum Dynamics, his bribery for contracts, the laundering. He's been running a criminal empire from day one. Federal evidence already tied him to stolen algorithms, falsified demos, and massive tax evasion. Sarah's new intel added obstruction of justice and witness tampering, with his 9-year-old daughter as the key witness. Conspiracy. Each carried years in prison. But Martinez had a warning. "Men like him don't go quietly. As we close in, he'll get desperate. With his resources and connections, we must assume he's capable of anything, including silencing her." Federal protection was authorized immediately. Safe houses, marshals, full witness protection protocols. "Your family court cases are cover," Martinez told her. "While they're distracted, we build the RICO indictment. Weeks, not months." Sarah understood the stakes. Duke, sensing the tension, planted himself between the door and the people he had sworn in his own canine way to protect. Richard Martinez's empire was about to fall. But as Agent Martinez said, cornered predators are most dangerous. The fight for Isabella's future had just become a fight for her life. Richard Martinez's unraveling began at 6:23 a.m. on a Wednesday, when his private banker informed him several offshore accounts had been frozen under federal investigation. Standing in his penthouse kitchen in silk pajamas, Richard's voice turned sharp. Those accounts are protected. No one should even know they exist. But the banker's reply was worse. Federal agents had mapped his entire hidden financial structure. By noon, cracks appeared in the empire he'd built. His Instagram, once a polished feed of luxury, shifted to rambling defenses. Some people can't handle success. #truth wins. #haters gonna hate. Amber noticed the change first. Richard pacing, flinching at sounds, muttering about conspiracies. When she suggested therapy, he exploded. "I don't need a therapist. I need people to stop stealing what I've earned." He frantically moved assets into crypto, wired funds at all hours, sold investments in a panic. But his legal team's sudden shift in tone made it real. Margaret Steinberg advised settling his family court case to appear committed to his daughter's welfare. Richard's answer was ice. Not one penny. When his lawyers urged caution due to potential RICO charges, he ordered them out. Even now they saw him as dangerous. Outside, the FBI tracked every move. Richard had become the type of man agents request backup for. The threats began with Sarah Walsh's police cruiser. Its windshield was smashed. "Stop interfering," painted in blood-red letters. Duke, her German Shepherd partner, growled, recognizing the scent. This was targeted. That day, Sarah received anonymous calls. "You and your animal partner have become obstacles. Obstacles can be removed." Then came a sophisticated smear, fabricated witness statements and doctored photos accusing Duke of aggression. Filed with Internal Affairs. Sarah knew why. Duke was the only one who could follow their scent trails. "It's because of me, isn't it?" Sarah knelt, assuring her the only guilty party was the one making threats. The FBI moved Isabella and her mother Maria to a federal safe house. Days later, someone planted drug paraphernalia in Maria's bedroom to destroy her credibility. Duke's nose caught the synthetic scent, expensive cologne and cigarettes, evidence of a professional frame job. Sarah realized Richard had crossed from intimidation into outright terrorism. The breaking point came in the boardroom of Steinberg, Morrison and Associates. Richard arrived, manic and disheveled. Steinberg, flanked by 5 associates, ended their representation. His retainer payments were now evidence in a money laundering probe, and his crimes, planting evidence, bomb threats, had crossed their moral line. "We don't represent terrorists." Richard's eyes went cold. "I'll handle this myself." Driving back, he decided to flee the country, but at the penthouse, he found Amber gone, along with her belongings, jewelry, and 200,000 cash. Her note was short. "I can't be part of whatever you're becoming. The person I fell in love with doesn't exist anymore." That night, Richard posted a paranoid manifesto, accusing his ex-wife, the FBI, and his lawyers of conspiring against him. It was exactly the trigger the FBI had been waiting for. "He's ready to run," Agent Martinez told Sarah. Surveillance showed private jet bookings to non-extradition countries, Swiss wire transfers, and meetings with identity forgers. Days, maybe hours. If he can't run, he might eliminate witnesses. Sarah's mind went to Isabella. Protected, yes, but still his daughter. And Richard Martinez was now a man with unlimited resources, nothing to lose, and one goal left: survival at any cost. Duke stayed close, his body language saying what Sarah already knew. This wasn't just about justice anymore. It was about keeping a little girl alive in the crosshairs of a cornered predator. At 5:30 a.m., the FBI field office hummed with the precision of a military operation. Agent Patricia Martinez stood before a packed room of federal agents, local police, and specialists, her tone sharpened by urgency. On the screens behind her, surveillance photos, financial charts, and schematics of the enemy's strongholds. "Operation Clean Slate," she began, "isn't just a custody case gone wrong. This is a RICO takedown. Fraud, bribery, money laundering, witness intimidation, and conspiracy to commit murder." Sarah Walsh sat in the front row, Duke pressed against her leg. Weeks of undercover work and intelligence gathering had led here. Sarah had mapped Richard Martinez's surveillance network, documented his intimidation tactics, and sketched the psychological profile of a man who already uncovered evidence other methods missed. Today, they'll find anything hidden, tampered with, or designed to evade detection. The plan was sprawling: 14 simultaneous raids, Richard's penthouse, his shell companies, consulting firms, and laundering fronts. $400 million in assets were marked for seizure. Martinez didn't soften the warning. Richard is armed, unstable, and willing to harm children. Assume he's prepared to kill. Then came the intel that shifted everything from an arrest to a rescue mission. At midnight, Richard booked a private jet to a non-extradition country. Departure 8 a.m. He's not just fleeing, he's planning to disappear. And we have credible reports he's seeking permanent solutions to his witness problem. The room went still. Everyone knew witness meant Isabella, his 9-year-old daughter. Martinez's final words cut through the tension. "We move now. He leaves in handcuffs or not at all." The convoy rolled out into a city just waking under a gray and gold dawn. Sarah adjusted Duke's vest, the weight of the moment in every buckle and strap. "She trusted me to protect her," she told Martinez. "I won't let her down." By the time they surrounded one financial plaza, the operation moved like clockwork. Richard's penthouse, an entire 42nd floor of glass and steel, was sealed from the lobby to the roof. The elevator ride up felt like entering the lion's den. Martinez's voice crackled in their earpieces. "He's desperate, cornered, stay sharp." The steel-reinforced door shattered under the battering ram. Inside, the excess was blinding. Picassos, marble floors, chandeliers worth small fortunes. But not a single photo of Isabella or her mother. Only images of Richard and Amber, posing in the life his crimes had bought. "FBI, Richard Martinez, you're under arrest." From deeper inside, the whir of shredders. Duke's nose dropped to the floor, pulling Sarah through a maze of designer rooms into a home office. What she found froze her in place. One wall was plastered with surveillance photos, hundreds, of Isabella and Maria, walking to school, shopping, sleeping in her bed, photographed through her window, a stalker's shrine. Duke pressed forward, finding more. A command center humming with monitors tracking GPS bugs planted in Maria's car, audio feeds from their apartment, financial monitoring software charting every purchase Maria made. The takedown itself was almost pathetic. Richard, the billionaire mogul who once commanded boardrooms, cowered in a walk-in closet stuffed with designer suits, clutching a laptop like a life raft. "You don't understand. I built this. They're stealing everything." Martinez read him his rights, adding the dagger. "Amber Collins has been cooperating with us for 3 months. Every conversation, every plan. You've been recorded." His face twisted from disbelief to rage to collapse. The perp walk made headlines worldwide. Split-screen images of Richard the visionary and Richard the criminal. Head bowed, wrists cuffed. Back in the penthouse, the evidence told the real story. Richard's encrypted servers, cracked after hours of FBI cyber work, were a blueprint for organized evil. Files labeled Family Elimination Protocol, Witness Neutralization, Asset Protection Strategy. Recordings captured his voice, cold and businesslike. The girl is the primary threat to operational security. Standard intimidation has failed. We need more permanent solutions. Duke found the hidden partition. In it, Richard's Life Optimization Manifesto, detailing how to erase inconvenient people from his past, starting with emotional isolation, escalating to legal intimidation, and ending in permanent resolution of legacy complications. One laminated page was a hit list. At the top, Isabella, then Maria, then Sarah, Duke, Martinez. Every name paired with addresses, routines, and suggested methods for resolution. Sarah stared at her own name, her pulse spiking. He was planning to kill all of us. Martinez moved through financial ledgers showing the theft of hundreds of millions through stolen tech and government contracts, funneled into a network of bribes, shell companies, and hired criminals. The recordings named corrupt judges, paid-off investigators, and a system weaponized against innocent people. Outside, the story was already exploding. Billionaire tech mogul planned to murder own daughter, stolen fortune built on child's tears. The scandal wasn't just Richard. It was the web of power that had protected him. By the time they left, the penthouse was no longer a fortress. It was a crime scene. Sarah stood on the balcony, looking over the city in full daylight. Somewhere out there, Isabella was waking up, free of her father's shadow for the first time. Duke sat at her side, calm and steady. He didn't need to be told they'd won. He could smell it. Martinez joined her. It's over. He'll never threaten them again. Sarah exhaled, feeling the months of tension ease. The glass mansion had fallen. In its ruins lay enough truth to ensure Richard Martinez would spend the rest of his life in a cell. The war for Isabella's future was over, and the good guys had won. The FBI's main briefing room had been transformed into a high-security media center for one of the most shocking press conferences in recent law enforcement history. Agent Patricia Martinez stood behind a podium, 9-year-old child. "This is not just the arrest of Richard Martinez," she began. "It is the dismantling of a criminal network that defrauded the United States of hundreds of millions of dollars while targeting innocent victims, including his own daughter. The investigation had begun 3 years earlier when whistleblowers at Quantum Dynamics reported the theft of $500 million in AI technology. What started as an IP theft case unraveled into bribery, corporate espionage, and violence. Martinez showed communications proving Richard had planned to erase all ties to his family, even preparing falsified death certificates and offshore accounts for a new identity, Marcus Richardson, after killing his wife and daughter. His fortune had been built entirely on fraud, bribed procurement officials, fake technology demonstrations, and contracts that jeopardized national security. Yet the most chilling revelations were personal. Richard had waged a calculated campaign to drive his daughter Isabella to suicide to avoid paying child support. Detective Sarah Walsh took the podium, with her German Shepherd partner Duke sitting calmly beside her. She described how Duke's tracking skills uncovered hidden surveillance gear in Isabella's bedroom, GPS trackers, and recordings of Richard discussing hiring killers to eliminate his ex-wife, daughter, investigators, and anyone threatening his empire. Richard's hit list reached deep into law enforcement and the courts. Martinez closed with a grim truth. Richard Martinez represents the complete absence of conscience, empathy, and basic human decency. The press left with a story that would dominate headlines for months. A celebrated tech mogul exposed as a remorseless predator. 72 hours after Richard's arrest, Judge Patricia Williams convened an unprecedented emergency session in family court. This was the same courtroom where Richard had once dismissed his marriage as a previous domestic arrangement. Now it was to formally acknowledge his systematic cruelty. Isabella sat between Sarah Walsh and her mother, Maria, no longer the frightened child from months earlier, but a survivor. The judge addressed her directly. "You have shown courage and wisdom that shames every adult who failed to protect you. Every accusation made against you or your mother was fabricated to destroy your family." The court froze and seized all of Richard's assets, allocating most for victim compensation. Isabella's college fund was established from his seized fortune. A lifetime restraining order barred him from any contact. Maria was vindicated, the court acknowledging she had saved her daughter's life while battling corruption at the highest levels. The community responded with an outpouring of support. Flowers, gifts, and visits from neighbors and school teachers. When reporters asked Isabella how she felt, her quiet answer chose to be a bad person. "But I'm not sad the good people stopped him. Being good is more important than being rich." Judge Williams also honored Sarah and Duke. They represent the very best of law enforcement. They saw a child in danger and fought for her, regardless of the risks. When Maria and Isabella returned to their apartment, it looked the same but felt entirely different. The new security system, restored family photos, and absence of fear marked the start of their healing. Dr. Jennifer Coleman guided them through narrative reconstruction, reframing them as survivors, not victims. One night, while cooking dinner, Isabella reflected, "I think Daddy believed money was more important than loving people. Once you believe that, you can convince yourself hurting people is okay." Maria marveled at her daughter's clarity. Sarah and Duke remained a constant presence, now as chosen family. Duke instinctively stayed close to Isabella, his calm presence offering security no counseling could match. Support poured in worldwide, scholarships, donations, and letters of admiration. Isabella announced her future goal: "I want to study law, not to be rich like Daddy wanted, but to help other kids whose parents try to hurt them." Her transformation from victim to advocate was complete. Maria returned to work with a new strength born of survival. They took a new family photo, this time including Sarah and Duke, surrounded by gifts and cards. Their faces radiated joy instead of fear. Life settled into a new normal. Dinners without fear of surveillance, plans made without worry, and peaceful nights knowing Sarah and Duke were just a call away. Isabella's prayers, once pleas for her father's love, became gratitude for those who had chosen to protect her. Real families are made of people who choose to love you. They didn't forget what they endured, but they built a future from it. The cruelty that was meant to break them instead became the foundation for resilience, purpose, and a chosen family, bound by love, not blood. The federal courthouse had seen many high-profile trials in its century of service, but none had drawn the worldwide attention of United States v. Richard Martinez. The man entering for sentencing barely resembled the billionaire who once commanded boardrooms. Shackled, gaunt, hair gray and unkempt, Richard Martinez wore the orange jumpsuit of federal custody, the uniform of a fallen empire. Judge Harold Morrison, who had presided over the 6-month trial, regarded him with the kind of controlled disgust reserved for criminals whose actions eroded the very foundations of human decency. "Mr. Martinez," Morrison began, his voice steady but heavy with condemnation, "in 37 years on this bench, I have never encountered a defendant who combined such sophisticated criminal planning with such disregard for human life, particularly the life of his own child." The jury conviction on all 43 counts had been swift. The evidence was so overwhelming that his lawyers advised him to plead guilty to avoid a possible death sentence for conspiracy to commit murder. RICO violations, fraud, laundering, tax evasion, witness tampering, domestic terrorism, a web of crimes ensuring Richard Martinez would never again be free. "You stole proprietary technology worth hundreds of millions, defrauded the U.S. of $400 million in contracts, and orchestrated a campaign of terrorism against your 9-year-old daughter that included plans for her murder," Morrison said. The 25-year sentence came with no parole, no family contact, and mandatory psychological evaluations. At 45, Richard would be 70 upon release, if he survived prison life, where crimes against children marked a man for retribution. Civil judgments stripped him of every asset. Over $600 million in properties, vehicles, art, and investments would fund victim compensation, services for families threatened by wealthy abusers, and scholarships for children who had survived domestic terrorism. His stolen wealth would be transformed into a shield for those he once targeted. The most damning moment of the penalty phase came from Amber Collins, granted immunity in exchange for testimony. Nervous but resolute, she recounted conversations that froze the courtroom. "He told me Isabella and Maria were temporary problems that would be permanently resolved before our first anniversary," she said. "He talked about their deaths like a business merger." Audible gasps rippled through the gallery. The idea that a man would plan his family's murders as a wedding gift cemented his status as a monster. Dozens of other victims joined a class action suit. Ruined business partners, silenced employees, competitors marked for elimination. Richard viewed people not as humans, but as obstacles to be removed. From prison, he tried to send Isabella a letter, framing his actions as misunderstood business decisions. Federal authorities intercepted it, recognizing another attempt to manipulate and re-traumatize her. His unrepentance was recorded in his file. Corporate America erased him with surgical precision. His name vanished from patents. Credit was reassigned to the engineers who had done the real work. NeuralSync Technologies, built on theft and fraud, was dissolved. Once a symbol of innovation, Richard Martinez became a cautionary tale about greed and narcissism. He was transferred to ADX Florence, the supermax for America's most dangerous criminals. The billionaire who thought himself untouchable learned that federal justice treated billionaires and paupers alike when they harmed children. 3 months after sentencing, a quiet Saturday afternoon found Isabella in Sarah Walsh's backyard watching Duke chase autumn leaves. At 14, she carried a thoughtful maturity that drew adults into unexpected conversations. "Sarah," she said, began, her tone contemplative, "Dr. Coleman said losing people who don't really love you is actually winning. I think I finally understand." Sarah set down her coffee, sensing this was a moment to remember. Duke, abandoning his game, settled near Isabella's feet. "When Daddy left, I thought it meant I wasn't good enough to keep," Isabella said, twirling a fallen leaf in her hands. "If I'd been smarter, prettier, more interesting, maybe he would have stayed." The pain in her voice was tempered by the clarity she'd earned. "But now I know he didn't leave because I wasn't good enough. He left because he wasn't good enough to be my father, to keep promises, to love someone more than he loved money." Sarah's throat tightened. "That's a very mature way to see it." "The scary part wasn't just that he left," Isabella went on. "It was that he tried to make me disappear, like I never existed. But that taught me the difference between real love and fake love." She reached down to scratch Duke's ears. Real love doesn't vanish when things get hard, or when someone gets more money, or finds someone prettier. Real love gets stronger when there's trouble, like yours, Duke's, and Mommy's. Many assumed she'd dropped the Martinez name, erasing the tie to her father. Her decision stunned them. I'm keeping it, not because I'm proud of him, but because I'm proud of me, she said with quiet conviction. Every time someone hears it, they'll know a little girl survived something terrible and came out stronger. That's my story now, not his. The scholarship Isabella had established with money from her father's seized assets reflected her transformation from victim to advocate, but it was her speech at the announcement ceremony that revealed the full extent of her wisdom and her commitment to helping other children in similar situations. Some kids think that when their parents leave or hurt them, it means they're not worth loving, Isabella had said to an audience of adults who found themselves hanging on every word spoken by someone who had just turned 14. But I learned that parents who hurt their children are just broken people who forgot how to love anything except money and power. The kids aren't broken, the parents are. Her speech continued with insights that challenged adult assumptions about childhood resilience and recovery. Adults always want to know if I'm okay, like surviving something terrible means you're either fine or you're ruined forever. But I think surviving makes you different, not better or worse, just different. I'm different because I know things about people and love and cruelty that I wish I didn't have to know. But I'm also different because I know how strong I am and how good people really are when they choose to protect kids instead of hurt them. Duke's special bond with Isabella had evolved into something that transcended typical canine partnerships. The German Shepherd seeming to recognize that his role in her life was no longer professional, but personal. When Isabella spoke at public events or gave interviews about her experience, Duke would position himself near her, with protective alertness that communicated his continued commitment to her safety and welfare. Duke saved my life, Isabella would often say when asked about their relationship, but not just by finding evidence and protecting me from bad people. He saved my life by showing me that some creatures, people and dogs, choose to love you not because they have to, but because they want to. That's the most important thing anyone ever taught me. The realization that she had become an advocate for abandoned children everywhere came gradually, as Isabella began receiving letters from children around the world who had survived similar experiences. Her responses, carefully crafted with help from Dr. Coleman and Sarah, became templates for resilience that child psychologists began using in their own practices. You are not responsible for your parents' mistakes, Isabella would write to children whose fathers had abandoned or abused them. You are not too expensive, too difficult, or too anything. Parents who hurt their children or leave them are just people who forgot how to love properly. But there are other people, teachers, police officers, social workers, chosen family like Sarah and Duke, who remember how to love children the right way. Find those people and let them help you remember how valuable you are. As the afternoon light faded and Duke settled into his favorite spot beside Isabella's chair, Sarah marveled at the transformation she had witnessed. The frightened 9-year-old who had once asked why her daddy had thrown her away had become a young woman whose wisdom inspired adults and whose advocacy was already changing how society understood and responded to domestic terrorism against children. The incredible outcome wasn't just that Isabella had survived her father's systematic cruelty. It was that she had transformed that survival into a force for protecting other children who faced similar threats. Evil had tried to destroy her, but instead had forged her into someone whose strength would protect the vulnerable for decades to come. 5 years had transformed Isabella Martinez from a terrorized 9-year-old into a poised 14-year-old whose presence commanded respect in rooms full of adults who had gathered to hear her speak about resilience, justice, and the power of chosen family. Standing behind the podium at Lincoln High School's graduation ceremony, wearing the gold honor cords that marked her as valedictorian, Isabella looked out over an audience that included not just her classmates and their families, but reporters, child welfare advocates, and survivors of domestic violence who had traveled from around the country to witness this moment. Sarah Walsh and Duke sat in the front row, their presence representing the continuity of protection and love that had sustained Isabella through the darkest periods of her young life. Sarah wore her dress uniform for the occasion, the commendations on her chest telling the story of a career dedicated to protecting the vulnerable, while Duke wore a special ceremonial collar that marked him as an honorary member of the graduating class. Maria Martinez, now Dr. Maria Martinez, after completing her psychology degree with a specialization in trauma recovery, sat beside them with tears of pride streaming down her face. The woman who had once scraped together grocery money while fighting for her daughter's life now directed the Martinez Foundation for Family Justice, a nonprofit organization that provided legal and financial support to families threatened by wealthy, abusive ex-spouses. 5 years ago, Isabella began her valedictorian speech, her voice carrying the confident clarity that had made her a sought-after speaker on children's rights. I learned the difference between being abandoned and being freed. When someone who claims to love you tries to hurt you instead of protect you, losing them isn't a tragedy, it's a rescue. The foundation that Isabella and Maria had established with Richard's seized assets had grown into a national resource that helped thousands of families navigate legal systems that were often corrupted by wealth and power. The Martinez Foundation's legal clinic had won precedent-setting cases that made it harder for abusive parents who weaponize family courts, while their support services provided therapy, security, and advocacy for children who faced threats from their own families. Isabella's continued media appearances had evolved from telling her survival story to advocating for systematic changes in how society protected children from domestic terrorism. Her testimony before congressional committees had led to new federal legislation that made family court intimidation a federal crime, while her work with international human rights organizations had helped establish protocols for protecting child witnesses in cases involving wealthy defendants. The documentary, The Price of Silence, the Isabella Martinez story, had won several awards and become required viewing in law schools and social work programs across the country. The film's power came not from sensationalizing Isabella's ordeal, but from her own narration, which transformed a story of victimization into a testament to the resilience of the human spirit and the power of adults who chose to protect rather than exploit the vulnerable. Richard's complete fall from grace had been so thorough that his name appeared only in cautionary tales about corporate corruption and the dangers of unchecked narcissism. The technology industry had moved on from his stolen innovations. Law enforcement had adopted his case as a model for investigating family court corruption, and business schools used his story to teach ethics. Courses about the inevitable consequences of building success on foundations of fraud and cruelty. My father taught me something important, though he didn't mean to, Isabella continued her speech, her words carrying to the back of the auditorium where standing-room-only crowds had gathered to hear her wisdom. He taught me that people who try to make you disappear are actually showing you how strong and important you are. If you weren't a threat to their lies, they wouldn't work so hard to silence you. The standing ovation that followed Isabella's speech lasted for nearly 10 minutes, with audience members rising to their feet not just to celebrate her academic achievement, but to acknowledge the incredible journey that had brought her to this moment. Teachers who had watched her transform trauma into advocacy, classmates who had learned about courage from her example, and strangers who had been inspired by her story, all joined in recognition of something that transcended typical graduation celebrations. "I want to dedicate this achievement to everyone who believed I was worth fighting for," Isabella said, as the applause finally subsided, her eyes finding Sarah and Duke in the audience. "To Detective Walsh and Duke, who taught me that real families are chosen, not inherited. To my mother, who showed me that love means protecting someone even when it's dangerous. To all the adults who chose to listen to a scared little girl instead of dismissing her concerns. You saved my life, but more than that, you taught me that my life was worth saving." Sarah felt Duke press against her leg as they both watched Isabella accept her diploma, the German Shepherd's calm satisfaction evident in his relaxed posture. The frightened child they had first met in the police station had become a young woman whose strength inspired everyone who encountered her, and whose advocacy was already protecting other children from similar horrors. The final image that would stay with everyone present was Isabella holding up her acceptance letter to Harvard Law School. The document representing not just academic achievement, but the fulfillment of a promise she had made to herself years earlier. Her dream of helping other abandoned children was one step closer to reality, and everyone who had supported her journey understood that they were witnessing the emergence of someone who would dedicate her life to protecting the vulnerable. "This is just the beginning," Isabella said in her closing remarks, her voice carrying the quiet determination that had characterized her survival and recovery. "Every child who is threatened by people who should protect them deserves advocates who won't give up, legal systems that can't be bought, and communities that choose love over money. That's what I'm going to spend my life building." As the graduation ceremony concluded and Isabella was surrounded by well-wishers and supporters, Sarah caught a glimpse of the future that stretched ahead. Law, school, a career in child advocacy, probably a lifetime of fighting for kids who faced threats from the people who should love them most. The incredible legacy of Isabella's survival wasn't just that she had overcome systematic evil, but that she had transformed that survival into a force for protecting others. Richard Martinez had tried to create a perfect life by erasing his daughter, but instead had created his own worst nightmare, a daughter whose strength, wisdom, and advocacy would protect vulnerable children for generations to come. The little girl who had once asked why her daddy had thrown her away had become a young woman who would spend her life ensuring that no other child ever had to ask that question alone. In the end, Isabella's story reminds us of something profound. The bonds we form with those who choose to protect us, whether human or canine, can heal even the deepest wounds. Duke wasn't just a police dog doing his job. He became family, offering the kind of unconditional loyalty that only our four-legged companions truly understand. There's something magical about the way dogs see straight into our hearts, isn't there? They don't care about our bank accounts or our mistakes. They simply choose to love us, defend us, and stand by us when the world feels uncertain. Duke's devotion to Isabella showed us that sometimes the most powerful love comes on four paws, with a gentle soul and an unbreakable spirit. If you've been blessed with a German Shepherd or any loyal companion, you know this feeling. Perhaps you'd like to deepen that special connection you already treasure. There's a wonderful resource I've come across that might help you understand your dog's heart even more deeply. Not because you need fixing, but because love like this deserves to be celebrated and nurtured. Your bond is already beautiful. Sometimes we just need gentle reminders of how extraordinary it truly is.